Well, hi there. It's me, Penny. Welcome to my office. As many of you know, I've been greatly influenced by the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould. And years ago, back in 2008 when I lived in Toronto, I had an opportunity to work part-time as a contributing author for the Glenn Gould Foundation. I was there for a few years, and one of the perks of this job was that I got to interview a number of individuals who worked with Glenn Gould in some capacity or another. I want to share with you today in this video some stories and personal memories about one of those individuals that I got to interview back in 2009. It is April 14th, 2009. That was the day that my friendship began with the lovely lady Mariana Schrader. Sadly, as I just discovered very, very recently, Mariana passed away in June of this year. Her husband as well. Has been very sad and devastating news. Trying to wrap my head around this. I lost my high school piano teacher in June as well, and the news of that was very sudden and unexpected. So who knows? 2022 has been a bit of a rough year, but being a bit of a magpie when it comes to taking notes and things, I have a lot of scraps of paper where I write down memories and things that are meaningful to me. And when it comes to Glenn Gould and related individuals and content, I keep my little notes in this box here, and I have it labeled Glenn, which I think is very appropriate because the box is meant to be a record player, and we all know Glenn Gould loved the recording studio. So I'm going to pull out of my Glenn box my notes on dear Mariana Schrader. Now, as I say, I was conducting an interview for the Glenn Gould Foundation back in 2009 in April, and this interview, I have some more notes here, this interview was published in the August 2009 edition of their newsletter, which was called the Glenn Gould Monthly, and I was partly responsible for that newsletter. It didn't last for too long. I have not been able to find online on the Foundation's website this article. It seems to have been taken down, or perhaps I just have not yet located it. But it was a lovely experience interviewing her, and I think the interview is worth re-sharing here with you. And so I hope you will indulge me in that. I'm not sure how long this video will go because over the course of, 12 years or so, I visited Marianne, and oftentimes her husband Jerry as well. I visited her, I think it was 14 times. So we were pretty good friends, and in between that, it averaged about a one visit per year. For a few of those years I was living out west, and so there was no visits to be had at that time. But the visits were at least once a year, usually in the autumn, because we loved the fall foliage and walking out and going for hikes and things. And she would often have me over for dinner and or tea, and we would have just some really lovely conversations, and she would share some memories too from time to time about her time working with Glenn Gould. So I'm going to keep her wonderful spirit alive, because I don't think there's anywhere on the internet where you can find out about this dear lady. And so I got stuff to share. So I'm going to first of all read the interview that, as I say, came out in the August 2009 edition of the Glenn Gould Monthly. And and then I will read through just a few. I've got quite a few pictures to share too, so I'm going to sort of flash some of those pictures on the screen as we go, and I have some notes from another of my visits from her a few years later that I think will be of interest to you. I share this because there is. Glenn Gould was a Canadian icon. He was one of the great pianists ever to live and breathe, and he happened to be from Canada. And that little me from Peace River, Alberta, and later Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, got to come into contact with some of the people who worked with him is a precious thing that I will cherish till the day I die. Really. And I often like to think that I have a lot in common with Glenn, except for the brain power. When it comes to liking radios and Bach and playing fugues and being out in the dreary gray wintry autumn days in a blizzard and a rainstorm, moody colors, dogs, a desire to try to be kind and good. I have a lot in common actually with him, except for the brain power. He was truly a genius. But we're just going to go through some of these stories. So this interview with Marianne Schrader was titled "Looking Back to the Idea of North," an interview with Marianne Schrader. It opens with her own quote, which was used in The Idea of North. She said, "I was fascinated by the country as such. I flew north from Churchill to Coral Harbour on Southampton Island at the end of September. Snow had begun to fall, and the country was freshly covered by it. Some of the lakes were frozen around the edges, but towards the center of the lake you could still see the clear water. And flying over this country, you could look down and see various shades of green in the water, and you could see the bottom of the lakes, and it was a most fascinating experience." Listening to the gentle voice of Marianne Schrader in these opening lines from the prologue to The Idea of North, a radio documentary produced by Glenn Gould in 1967 as part of the Canadian Centennial, I wondered how Glenn came to find interesting people to provide Arctic narratives to his contrapuntal radio project. Marianne proved to be just as gracious and warm as I had expected, her countless stories offering a glimpse into her association with Gould and the Canadian North. As a nurse in the mid-1960s, Marianne, who now lives in Hamilton, Ontario, spent 2 years living in Coral Harbour, Nunavut, a community located on Southampton Island at the 64th parallel. "I actually chose to go there," said Marianne, when asked how she became stationed in the remote village. "My family came to Canada from Europe in 1955, and it was not long after that I decided to become a nurse. In 1960, I was accepted by the Sisters of Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg. Before graduation, I remember people coming in from different nursing communities to tell us about our options. 2 people were from National Health and Welfare, and they had been taking care of Inuit people in the north." After graduation, Marianne and one of her classmates, a Mennonite from southern Manitoba, went to a small hospital north of Winnipeg where they gained the experience necessary for work in the north. The story of how Marianne came to work with Glenn on The Idea of North, or simply North as it came to be known, is an unusual one. It was during the course of her studies in Winnipeg that Marianne accepted an invitation to do some babysitting at a local home. The family turned out to be Joan Maxwell Rempel, the well-known mezzo, and her husband Harvey. Since I had no family in Winnipeg, remarked Marianne. I ended up becoming quite close to the Rempels, and even spent many a holiday function with them. Joan and Glenn were very good friends, and Glenn was even named a godfather to one of the Rempel children. It was during this time that Glenn started putting together people to talk about their experiences in the Canadian North. Marianne recalls a time in the mid-1960s following her time at Coral Harbour when she was living at Annesley Hall, the all-female residence at Victoria College at the University of Toronto. In through the main doors of Annesley came Glenn one afternoon, she explained. He had come to ask if I would be interested in participating in an upcoming radio documentary about the Canadian North. Aside from what Joan had told me, I didn't know much about Glenn at this time. I had heard him give a concert in Detroit back in the late 1950s when my family lived in Windsor. I remember the on-stage mannerisms that had become his trademark, and so needless to say, when I met him I was not surprised by his appearance. Shoelaces undone, mismatched socks, disheveled hair, and whatever else I don't remember. I thought to myself, yes, I've heard about this fellow. Unfortunately, however, I'm not a musician, and so I hadn't followed his career. She went on to explain that with the exception of CBC radio technician and longtime Gould friend Lorne Tulk, none of the participants from North ever met. I'm not even sure that any of the other participants had anything to do with Glenn, other than having been recommended, she remarked. The other participants included Jim Lotz, Frank Valley, Robert Phillips, and narrator Wally McLean. I don't think Glenn pre-planned the roles for any of the characters, Marianne explained. I like to think that the characters evolved out of their experiences. Glenn would simply say, "Tell me about your experiences in the Arctic." That you had lived there was the only criteria. Marianne describes her encounter with Glenn at the CBC studio on Jarvis Street in Toronto as being short-lived, the complete interview taking place over the course of just 2 or 3 sessions, each for a few hours. I saw him only a couple of times, she explained. Unlike some of the other characters, example Jim Lotz. I don't even remember whether I saw him during Judith Perlman's filming of The Idea of North. In the studio, he was very kind to me. I remember being very nervous as he asked me questions about my time in the North. Several times he would say, "Let's have a cup of coffee. We need a break." And so we'd take a little break and talk. I had nothing written down for the interview part, but rather would answer questions as we went along. It was all so new to me, and I was really quite young and inexperienced. I remember Lorne working from a small enclosed soundproof chamber of sorts. This memory is a very vivid one. The technology available back then was really quite amazing, and I was particularly struck by Glenn's ability to join the thoughts of each person in such a way as to offer different perspectives on the same theme. I think what Glenn was trying to do was to make a drama out of the voices, coordinating our thoughts so as to create something of a melodic nature. The whole piece was quite operatic in style, and while you couldn't necessarily understand all of the dialogue, you definitely got a sense of what was going on. After all, Glenn knew exactly what he wanted and how he would go about creating it. I think that's a real gift. Myself, I don't always have it. And she laughs there. In each of my interviews with Glenn's friends and colleagues, the issue has come up of his having possessed a supreme gift of conversation, and specifically the ability to ask questions in such a way as to generate the answers he sought. Glenn really was an excellent interviewer, and as Lorne has said, Glenn would guide people in the direction he wanted them to go. He must have done that with me, too. I was listening to North today, as a matter of fact, and kept thinking to myself, did I really say that? I looked at life very differently back then when I was younger. Today, I know that we're all a part of creation. We all are. Nevertheless, the experience did have a great impact on me, learning about the vastness of the world and how different people are. My experiences in the North taught me respect, although one doesn't have to go there to do that. Life in the Arctic was not without its challenges, and as Marianne explained, it's the isolation that eventually takes its toll. I remember being advised not to leave the village on my own because there were wild packs of dogs. The job itself was a stressful one, and the people couldn't always understand you. The culture of the whites and of the Inuit people were very different. Whole families basically lived in one room, grandparents and children. As for amenities, well, there wasn't much. In October, the ice was fairly thick, and so we'd cut it and use it for water in the nursing station. We did have a shortwave radio and a couple of records, which my Mennonite friend would often sing along to. I remember she liked listening to Billy Graham, though I found his voice a little too forceful. In spite of everything, I fell in love with the Arctic. Of course, I didn't get into any of this sort of thing with Glenn. He wanted to know about our isolation in the North. And I think the narrator from North put it best when he said that in isolation, you really come face to face with yourself. That is, you have to work things out. Is this my doing? Is it somebody else's doing? Is it nobody else's doing? This is the situation. Of course, I have always been comfortable being alone, and so in that respect, I suppose my time in the North was a natural thing, a product of my need for quiet. Marianne then pulled out some photos taken during her time in Coral Harbor, including one of herself wearing the Arctic gear provided by National Health and Welfare. In those days, you could tell men from women based on their clothing, she explained. Parkas in the eastern Arctic were different from those in the west. As for snow, there wasn't all that much of it, though I do remember many a whiteout. The 2 years spent in Coral Harbor were not the only experiences that Marianne has had in the North. In addition to visits to Fort Smith, Whitehorse, and Skagway, I was most impressed to learn that in 1975, she spent 10 days hiking through the Badlands of the Baffin Island. I had attended some presentations by people who were considering doing a hike in the area, and after a test hike in the Adirondack Mountains, it was agreed that I would join 9 men on the journey through the area known as Oyutuk National Park. Pulling out a guidebook called The Land That Never Melts, Marianne pointed to the cover photo of 2 hikers in the middle of what appeared to be a vast expanse of northern nothingness, adding that the one on the right is me. Thinking to myself what a brave soul one must have to endure such conditions, Marianne added, I never thought of it as brave. I just thought of it as a place I'd like to go. More than 40 years have passed since the creation of the idea of North, a period which has seen tremendous interest towards the program by Gould fans around the world. I had no idea about the impact this whole project would have and how widely it would be distributed, explained Marianne. I just didn't give it too much thought. I just went along with it without thinking of the consequences. My concern at the time was, where does this microphone go? Of course, I was aware of his fame, and so in a way it was exciting to work with him, particularly during the Canadian Centennial, for a project which was broadcast by CBC, and to go for drives, etc. She laughs. It's really just one of those things in life that you don't expect could ever happen. I must confess that while I don't understand many of the intricacies of the idea of North, I have come to hear in it a harmony as well as a dissonance, and in this regard it is a highly musical work. Kevin Bazana interviewed me for his book Wondrous Strange, and I must admit that I agree with him that Glenn was very much expressing his own personality in the work. As the interview came to an end, I asked Mariana if she had ever seen the statue that stands outside the Glenn Gould studio on Front Street. To my surprise, she replied that she had not, and so the two of us visited the popular site. I will not forget the warmth and innocence of Marianne's reaction upon seeing it for the first time. "Oh, Glenn!" she exclaimed. "There you are after all these years. Old friend, you are looking well." And with that she pulled out a scarf that had on it a grand piano, sat down on the bench, and posed for a photograph. Mariana's life has certainly been an exciting one, and as someone who is now about the same age as Mariana was during her time in Coral Harbor, I find myself contemplating what isolation will mean to me 40 years from now. I suspect it will always be a refuge for the cultivation of thought and imagination, no doubt two necessary ingredients in the creation of the idea of North. That is my interview from April 2009 with Mariana Schrader. So Mariana and I hit it off quite splendidly, just like peanut butter and jam on that particular session, and that began our friendship, which would last more than 10 years. I do have an audio recording of that interview from 2009. I dug it up. It's 75 minutes long, if you can believe it, but the audio is terrible. You can hardly make out anything. So unless someone has some idea of how to preserve this recording, and do let me know. Otherwise, we're just going to keep that in the external hard drive folder. I think we were in the lobby of a hotel somewhere around Bloor Street and Avenue Road in Toronto. So it was very loud in there. It was a good thing I took notes. So anyhow, as I say, we had a lovely time, and there are some pictures that you saw of Mariana and I. And my favorite is the one of her sitting with the statue of Glenn Gould on Front Street, which is right outside the Glenn Gould studio at CBC. And Ruth Abernethy is the sculptor of that lovely statue, and she's a very kind lady. I know her as well. So anyhow, that was our first visit, Mariana and I, and we kept in touch. And a year later, I have in my notes, May 2010, we got together. She was quite active at that time. She was driving all over the GTA. As I recall, she loved nature. She really did. And not just the north, but hiking around the escarpment in Hamilton, and we did a lot of that, and going to the Royal Botanical Gardens, things like this. She was always feeding the critters in the backyard. I think I have a picture of her bending down to feed the raccoons. And her husband Jerry was the same way. They were really they loved nature. But as I say, this next visit we had from May 2010, we went to Niagara Falls, and I'm just looking at some of the pictures I'll show you on the screen there. I can't remember the name of the little side road where we were. There's a picture of me on a tree, and then this we've got one of the Devil's Punch Bowl in Hamilton. That was Mariana was very excited and proud to show me that. We got some lovely photos of the two of us with Niagara Falls in the background, and I think that's probably my fondest memory of her there. She was just so alive and happy and just full of zest that day. It was really quite special. So then, let's see. Um, it was a while before we had our next visit. Of course, we were keeping in touch over email and sometimes over the phone or FaceTime. Um, she would always send me a Christmas card, and she would remember my birthday, which was very, very nice. And I would send her cards as well, and so that was quite pleasant. So the next visit then, after May 2010, was that autumn, October 2010, and that was a time when we saw a lot of lovely foliage. And Jerry, her husband, came with us for a hike. You can see some pictures of us there. It was a foggy day, and we were walking around the Niagara Escarpment, Hamilton area. Quite beautiful. And she would have me for supper often, and we would just have nice conversations. And she was always asking about my parents and my grandparents, and took an interest in my music. She was really and a good listener. Such a good listener. I could talk on, and she was just alert the whole time and taking it all in, and I appreciate that, because not everyone can do that. Let's see, we had another visit in a year later in autumn, November 2011. I was at their house again, had a little tea party, and I think this was the occasion. Yeah, this was the occasion. I'll just show you a few more photos there. It was quite cold that day, and I was wearing my big, thick Irish sweater. And as was often the case when we went for walks, I didn't have enough clothing with me for the temps, and she would loan me one of her coats, which was the case here. And you can see we're not exactly the same size, and so with that big sweater, it was a little snug. But that was the visit where, and I've got notes on this. This is November 17th, 2011. And I have Mariana picked me up at the GO station in Hamilton. I used to like riding the GO train. I still do, just don't do it very often. Always loved trains. But she picked me up at the station, and I spent the day with her and her husband. We had lunch. We went to their house. We stopped at Bennett's, a nice apple farm. It was a farmer's market on the way home in Ancaster. Mariana loved golden, delicious apples, I have in my notes. And then she said to me, much to my extreme delight, she asked if I would like to watch some home movies from her time up north in about 1965. She had just had the videos transferred to DVD from reel to reel. And yes, I wrote all this down as soon as I got home. I do that when I have visits with special people. So we watched these videos, and the footage reminded me of that from Judith Perlman's idea of North. Now, as I mentioned, Glenn Gould's radio program, The Idea of North, that came out in 1967. But a few years later, 1970, a video version, a film version of that came out by Judith Perlman, and Glenn Gould is in that. Each of the characters are in that, including Mariana. And I'll toss up a picture on the screen there from that film. You can see she's this was in 1970, so, and she was born in December 1933, so very, very young lady there, still in her 30s. And so we were watching these old movies of hers, and it was very bleak looking, the landscapes. This was her time up north, very bleak, desolate. The buildings, prefab, all looked the same. She was in Coral Harbor, as I noted in the interview, in Southampton, Hudson's Bay. The footage from there included footage of a polar bear hunt that she went on with the Inuit people. And she said at least 3 polar bears were killed, and that's why there's so few polar bears left now. Marianne told me that the Hudson Bay Company would buy polar bear skins back then. This is all stuff that she could have talked about when Glenn Gould was interviewing her, and maybe she did, but he thought, I don't want the part about the polar bear in my radio documentary. That's going to spoil the solitude, perhaps. You know, it's interesting to think how many of these memories of hers she may have said in the interview that got left out. But she said the Inuit people, they used all the parts of the animals that they hunted. It was quite gruesome footage of this slaughtering of the polar bears. It was a rough trip. She said, when I returned from this trip, my friend told me to get changed. I smelled of gasoline fumes, etc. They'd be in a small motorboat and they'd be shooting the polar bear. Then they'd hoist it up into the boat, get to the land and cut it up. And there was some seals as well. Then there was this part in her winter home videos where it was, I think there was a title on the screen that said Winter Fun. Another part we didn't get in the idea of North. Winter Fun. And this consisted of some footage of Mariana and the people that she was with up there in Coral Harbor. One person pulling another on cross-country skis. And there was a skidoo, a big Bombardier skidoo that was for the Department of Transportation people. There were dog sled races in this video footage of hers. And the Inuit people, she was saying, they didn't have a concept of pets. That was not something that they kept. She said that the hoods on their parkas were pointy, and that there was another nurse friend of hers who gave her a navy parka. Her and her friend were given a navy parka with pink trim and matching boots. And then there was some more footage of her actually being quite silly in the snow. 1965, silly in the snow with the other people, both Inuit and white people. And she was really cute. I remember telling her, you look cute in these videos. And I mentioned to her that it was funny. She had a nice purse. There she is up in the north, and she's got a nice purse. She was the only one in this video with a nice purse. Everyone seemed to be having fun. And I remember Mariana laughing as we watched this footage. She was quite enjoying herself, I have to say. And quite willing to have fun with the other people. Back then, there was a guy who picked her up and turned her upside down, and she rolled out onto the snow, and a lot of good-spirited fun there. Then there was some more home footage of her in about 1960 in Vienna in the forests, and when she was a young girl. And she laughed at how they all wore skirts for hiking, but good shoes. And she had another memory about being up north. She said, you'd say, I'm bushed, if you were sick of being out there. We watched the Judith Perlman film, The Idea of North, which is in this box set issued by Sony Classical a few years ago. It's called Glenn Gould on Television, the complete CBC broadcasts, 1954 to 77. There's, 10 DVDs. There's a lot of content there. And The Idea of North film is on disc 8. So we watched that together. And when Marianne heard her voice, she said, gee, I sound quite down there. Like, quite depressed in this interview with Glenn Gould. She said, "No wonder Glenn called me the disillusioned romantic." There's some footage in that film where Mariana is in her nurse uniform, scurrying up some steps, and she says that was taken in Toronto, on the part of the University of Toronto's campus. Yeah, she said she was thoroughly captivated by Judith Perlman's film. Marianne added, "Glenn did a real service to Canada when he made this." And I have here in my own notes, when Mariana told me this, I felt a sudden knowledge that Glenn Gould was pleased and appreciative wherever his energy is, as though he wanted, back in the 60s and 70s, to have someone he worked with, like Marianne, confirm the value of his work all these years later. It's a very strong feeling I've got, and I didn't tell Marianne. I just knew that he would have been truly grateful, if not relieved, were he alive today. So we were having this nice moment, Marianne and I suddenly thought of Glenn, and that he would be pleased, that someone he interviewed, Marianne, all those years ago, had such fond memories of the experience. She was particularly struck by Wally McLean's thoughts. He's the narrator in The Idea of North. And she said he had great insight into the North. And back to the footage of her in the film where she's adjusting her little nurse's hat. I asked her if she had to use a lot of bobby pins to hold the hat in place. And she said, "No, just a few. Just points to the middle." She said, "I remember it used to sometimes fall off when I bent over to help patients." I just love these little personal details. Marianne was amused at how, in The Idea of North, she speaks of wanting to get out of the North. "Meanwhile," as she said, "I went on to return to the North and have a 10-year love affair." The vastness of the North and the beauty were the things that she liked most about the North. I got another page of notes from this visit I had with her. This might have been the same visit where we also listened to just the audio recording, Glenn's original radio documentary of The Idea of North, which Marianne had. She actually had the last time I was there, she had a record of it. It was unsealed, and she was quite proud of it. But she had another copy too, as I recall, one that was unsealed, and she would listen to it from time to time. Mariana remembers not being well prepared or well briefed about her trip to the North to serve as a nurse prior to her trip. And she said, "We were told that it was us or nobody." Then she had some nice words for me. She said, "Penny, you're a real person. You're genuinely compassionate." And, that meant enough. To me, I wrote it down. She said the Inuit people had a name for her, for the sort of the make-believe doctor. And I believe the word was Anyatitsiok. So, pretend doctor. And I have in my notes that it was a huge treat to be able to watch Idea of North with Mariana and her home videos from the North together with her. I feel awfully special for her to have shared them with me. She wore a t-shirt that day that said something like, "Feeling like a bag of dirt." Then she said she got it at a garden supply place. Yeah, and there's a little bit more about the polar bear hunt that they would go on. There was a certain amount of adventure to it, but that it was hard watching that footage now, she said. Then there was another scene in the home video where she was carrying a rifle, and actually looking quite happy about going about her Arctic life with her rifle. uh, and then we had some supper, and she said grace and wished my family all the best, which was very sweet. Mariana talked about how up north you were advised not to even leave your home at night because of wild sled dogs. So even within the isolation of the north, you were isolated in the home, and this was very difficult. I have a note here on her facial expressions as she was listening to this footage of herself and watching it. And she looked amused and a little bit shocked and surprised at how she used to describe the North back then as a young lady. She said, "I sound really down." She even snickered at one of her comments in the film. She only briefly rode a dog sled. She said they were hard to steer and that you needed someone experienced. She talked about the Inuit working on the ice near the water without a life jacket and other things that we would consider essential for safety purposes. She remembered that she didn't think the Inuit people knew much about the rest of Canada, and said that they had really suffered a lot when they were forced to live with the white people. So there was a wide range of memories from her on that visit in November of 2011, which I'm glad I wrote down. Yeah, so I'm really glad that I kept such detailed notes on my memories with Marianne, because she was such a special lady. We really got along famously, very, very well. And I was so surprised and shocked to learn that she had passed away. And but going through these memories, my notes and the pictures, I feel instantly refreshed. A balm to the spirit. There was a whole bunch more visits that we had, and I'll show you some pictures. Here's some photos from, I guess this was June 2012. They had a lovely backyard, and we would often have refreshments out there. Following our walk, we would admire the birds in the garden treats. And on that particular day, you can see we're enjoying a toast. She had served me a little dose of Jägermeister. It's a very strong liquor, and with a dose of maple syrup in it. Ooh. I forget what it was called. That was interesting. So she loved that. And on another visit, I remember her husband. He liked wine, and the last visit I had, I think he offered some blueberry wine, which was locally made, and that was quite nice. And then moving on through time, we skipped a few years when I lived in Saskatchewan. But as soon as I was back in Mississauga working at the Steinway Piano Gallery, I got together. And this was in the spring of 2015. There's some photos here. Again, I borrowed her long sweater to stay warm on that particular day in May, I think it was. It was a little chillier than I expected. We were walking around the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Burlington area. She loved that place. And there were lilac trees all over. And so it was a little cloudy that day. But there's some pictures of the two of us and the flowers, the gardens. And then looks like the next visit was she came to me. I gave a recital, a Bach recital. I played, I think it was the Complete Inventions. Did I play the Sinfonias too? I can't remember. I must have. This was in Mississauga, and she came all the way out from Hamilton for that. And so there we are. And then it was later that year, again in the fall. We were always getting together in the fall. She just loved to go walking around the escarpment and around there. There was a nice trail nearby their house. And so I have some pictures here from that. That was a warm day in the fall, quite sunny. You can see the steep cliffs of the escarpment. And when we came back to her house, she was showing me some of these beautiful art pieces, hand carved by the Inuit people up north. And I particularly liked the little the little seal. He had the most adorable little expression on his face. Mariana loved art and music. I remember her talking about the symphony and the museums and gardens and also meditating in church. These things were very important to her. Then the next visit I had was a year later, summer of 2017. I think she had a little cast on her arm here. Here she's showing me her record of the Idea of North. And that's that was that. Just two pictures from that visit. I think that record of Idea of North, that's the one that's unsealed. And 2017 was the year that I created and produced for the Chamber Music Society of Mississauga a multimedia show with live performance entitled Glenn Gould 905, a triple birthday multimedia celebration. And Marianne came out to that. You can see there she is. And on the left is Ruth Abernethy, who was the sculptor of the statue of Glenn Gould that you saw earlier. And also Lauren Tulk and I. And that was a great performance. I was quite pleased with that. Never put on a show of that nature before, but really enjoyed creating and selecting the multimedia tracks and performing some really great music, pieces that Glenn Gould had played at one time or another in his career. And short while after Glenn Gould 905, which was in September of 2017, I think it was a month later, in the fall of 2017, we got together again. I can't remember where we were for this, but it was somewhere by the water, and it was a rural area in Niagara region, I think. And there was a beautiful lake, and I think we had lunch there. It was a beautiful. The weather was just terrific that day. We might have went to a farmer's market as well for some more apples. Or cider, this kind of thing. And then the next year, in the spring of 2018, we got together again for a visit at the Royal Botanical Gardens. And I think we've got some daffodils here. And lots of other flowers on display. That was a good year for flowers. Then the last actually not the last visit, but the last visit that I have pictures from was a very curious one. It took place in July of 2019, and I had remembered then that 10 years earlier, when I interviewed her, she had talked about a second trip north that she had made in about 1975. And I had been wanting to ask her questions about that trip. And so we planned for another interview about that second trip north here in 2019. And that interview I recorded and edited it alongside some musical adaptation of a work by Isadora Zidor from her album Star Navigation. And I created a blog post for my blog, and it was called Mariana Schrader, A Portrait in Sound. And I was quite pleased with that, and got her to talk about solitude and the North during this trip of hers when she went with all these men in 1975. And so you can read about that interview. You can listen to that interview over on my blog. I'll include a link to that, and you can listen to her. And it's the same distinctive voice, just a little older. And so there's some pictures here I took from that session because she had some slides from her trip north, and she had a wonderful little slide projector thing, tabletop. And so she was using that, and she got out the map of the Arctic and was showing me where she was in Frobisher Bay in the Badlands. And I have a wonderful memory of that interview, that we did it in her basement, and it was so calm and quiet in there. She used to meditate in the basement, and it was very tidy and so beautiful. And she told me on that occasion that there was a photograph that was taken of her and another individual, and it appeared on the cover of, what is it called? The Land That Never Melts. And this was the full title. It was a book, actually. The Land That Never Melts, Ayutthuk National Park. And it was edited by Roger Wilson. Came out in 1976. It seems to have been partly produced by the Government of Canada. And I found a link to this book online. I'd been searching for years, and I just found it today, actually. And you can see, I'll show it on the screen, that photo. It's a striking, beautiful photo of Marianne. She's the one on the right. I don't know who the person on the left is. And she was so proud of that photo. She actually had a copy of it herself in a beautiful frame. And so that was a very special occasion. And as I say, you can listen to that interview on my blog, which is called Further North. So that was 2019, and you know what happened in 2020. I did see Marianne. The last time I saw her was in September of 2020. We had been postponing our visits because of the various lockdowns as a result of the pandemic. It was a terrible time. And anyway, I had wanted to share with her this recording that I had made. So I went over to her place and I shared the recording and wanted to get her permission to put it on my blog. And she was, of course, yes, that was fine. And she wasn't in the best of health at the time, but nonetheless, we thoroughly enjoyed our visit. And that was the last I saw her. And I'm going to really miss her and Jerry too. They were really very special people in my life. I have a little picture of the two of them here. And I like to think I have many years left, but who knows? At some point I will not be here either, and these memories are special, and they involve one of the great Canadians of all time, Glenn Gould. And so I hope that by sharing these memories in a friendly fashion, maybe it'll prompt some people to take an interest in Glenn Gould, our Canadian Arctic, and nature, environmentalism, plants, animals, all that sort of thing. Glenn would be very pleased if you did. So on that note, I'm going to wrap this video up. I thank you for watching. This was a little bit of a longer video than usual, but I quite enjoyed it. If you're interested in content that's related to Glenn Gould, do let me know. Leave me a comment. I do get comments from time to time from people saying that my playing, I look a little bit like Glenn Gould when I play. I've been even told that I deliberately try to copy him, and I try to not mention him too much because I don't want that pot to be stirred. I'm just quite happy to play the way that that works for me. If it happens to resemble someone else a little bit, well, then so be it. But I do have, I always have things to say about Glenn Gould, so perhaps you'll hear a little bit more from me on that front at some point. But this channel is devoted to the music of Mr. B, and so you will be hearing some more of that and related teaching practice tips. I've been wanting to make a video about how to learn a fugue. This has been a difficult topic to unravel in my head because so much of what I do is very spontaneous and creative, but I do have some steps that I begin the process with, and so we'll take a stab at it. It probably won't be the last video I do about how to learn a fugue, but that one at some point in the near future will be coming along with more performances. And so I will wrap this up and wish you all the best. Thank you for watching. Stay well and happy practicing. Bye-bye.